Hello, I'm Sharon Gray. Today I'm going to show you how to paint a portrait. So portraits scare off a lot of people. It's very difficult to get the drawing correct. Once you get the drawing correct, I have to say the painting is a lot easier. But it's getting those features in the right place that makes a lot of people shy away from doing portraits, or frankly anything that's supposed to look recognizable. But today I'm going to take you step by step through my process for getting them down, and I think that you're going to find that it simplifies things quite a bit. So the first thing that you want to do is print out your reference material and measure it. Here I've used a ruler. I've gone ahead and saved some time and measured that the length is 8.5 inches and the width here, or the height, is 5.75 inches. Then I'm going to set up a proportionate rectangle on my drawing paper. I have done that by measuring as long as I could make my drawing. So I knew that that was going to be the tough part. It can be, since this is longer than it is wide, making sure that the drawing or that the watercolor paper would accommodate the length was most important. And the longest that I can make my picture is 9.75 inches. Then I set that equal in a proportion right here. 8.75 inches of the original over 5.75 over the original width equals 9.75 over x. So now I have to find the x. To do that, you just cross multiply 9.75 times 5.75 equals 8.5 times x, or 8.5x, and then divide out this by 8.5. And the answer that you come up with is 6.6 inches. So now that I know the length of my watercolor paper frame, and I know the width. So I just use a ruler and I measure that onto my watercolor paper, and then you see all of these funny marks around the outside. That's my external grid. I make those by dividing the measurement of working on the reference material first, divide the length in half, and that's my E point, divide it in half again, that's my C point here, divide that in half again, and I get B. So then I have A at the end, B, C, D, and because all of these increments are the same, you just number from A to I, or I did. It doesn't matter how many increments you use. The only thing that's important is that, number one, you have the same number of increments top to bottom, and then when you do it again for the sides, that those stay the same. And number two, that these correlate to the marks on your drawing paper or your finished watercolor paper. You have to have the same marks, otherwise it won't be useful to you as a grid. Because then, once you have that all measured and marked out, what you're going to do is take your time. I like to use a triangle so that I'm very accurate, and I find the large shapes. Now the biggest shape on a portrait is obviously going to be the head, but I'm going to line up the side of my graph and find things like the top of the head. That's right here at 2.5. See how this invisible line would cut the side of the grid at 2.5. Then I can go to my paper, because it correlates just right, and I can make a quick line at the 2.5 mark. That's the top of the head. And you're going to do that for the side of the head as well. Make sure that you're measuring the same thing from one to the other. So for instance, here I'm finding the side of the face. A different measurement might be the side of the hair. Okay, so you have to make sure that if you're measuring the side of the face on your reference material, then you take the side of the face over to your drawing paper as well. I'm sorry, I keep calling it my drawing paper, my watercolor paper. So that is D 3/4. I'm going to mark that, and then I'm going to use my grid to connect those lines and make another light, easy to erase guideline. I'm going to do that again for the bottom of the chin. And while I'm doing it, also the bottom of the hand here. Just make sure that every time you make a measurement, you're lining it up with your triangle. So I can't make a measurement accurately if things aren't lining up on the side. See how it's tilted? Whoop, not tilted. Tilted, and that's going to give me a different place that this bottom line marks over on the grid. So you have to be accurate every single time you make a mark. But here's this, and here's this. And then you just take your time, you place all of these guidelines, and once you have the large pieces placed, then it's going to be a lot easier for you to mark down the smaller shapes, like the eyes and the nose. Just want to make sure I have all of those large shapes first. So about F1/2 for the other side of the face. Okay, now I have marks for this square of her head, and within those guidelines, it's going to help me a lot, because at this point I can just go and sketch the head with confidence, knowing that I have at least the large shapes in the right place. And then this table is going to cut through at the same point as the bottom of the wrist. So I'm going to draw that table all the way across. Oh, except it's not quite straight. See, this one's right above the 7 and this one's at about 7.5. So when you make a mistake, I like to make my corrections with a kneaded eraser because it doesn't damage the tooth of the paper. Let's go back and erase it. Put in the right line. Marker down again. And don't do any of your lines too darkly, otherwise you're going to have a hard time erasing. So then I can find the same line here. So there are some natural lines in this composition, right above the 8 and right at the 8. So that's a good one. Anytime you can find a shape or a line that is very precise with your graph, something that touches one of your numbers exactly, make sure to put that in, because it's going to serve as a helpful guideline for placing other smaller shapes that don't have as exact a placement. Another line that I want is where the elbow bisects my horizontal axis here. So it's right between the B and the C, a little bit closer to the B side. And this arm, let's see, elbow is almost exactly at G. That's very helpful to know. So I have enough down here now that I can start sketching things in by just eyeballing a little bit more. But if you do your job well and you take your time, then you'll always have the grid to go back to and refer to if there's something that starts to look wrong. Like, oh, why doesn't this head look like it's the right shape? I'm using my grid. Oh, because I accidentally measured this according to the top of this shadow, and the actual top of the head should be here at the top of the hair. You know, whatever it is. You can go back and you can fix things more easily because you have your grid. I'm going to do the same thing to find the center of the eyes. So the center of the eyes should be a little above 5. But since that's a smaller shape, you also have to use your common sense and see if that looks right. It doesn't look right. That looks too low. So that's because this is at an angle. Okay, a little above the 6 and then 6.5. A little above the 6, 6.5. So you see I made my chin line a little bit too high. So now I need to erase and redraw. All right, so this is a somewhat boring process to watch. It's obviously very, very important. And actually, you need to spend the brunt of your time of your painting on the drawing phase, especially if you are drawing a portrait. So if you draw extremely well, but it was never exactly right, even in the drawing, it's never going to look right, obviously, as a painting. Even if your effects are fantastic and you get the exact right colors and everything looks wonderful, it's never going to look right. So spend most of your time right here, doing this, filling in, making adjustments, clarifying lines, etc., etc. I'm going to reshape, and I can use either my grid to refer to, or I can use the other shapes that I've already placed. So for instance, to place the eyes, I have a guideline that I drew from the grid for the center of the eyes, but as far as making the points of the eyes, the inside and outside corners, because this is going to line up at a somewhat obscure place, it's going to be better for me to make those smaller shapes so that they look accurate on the face itself, not referring to the grid, both because it's far away and because it doesn't end up on any particular letter or number. So unless you have something that lines up easily with your grid, when you get to the smaller details, you might have better luck just using your own common sense. Use your own eyes and see how things look. So the bottom of the nose here should be a little bit below 5.5. See how that's, so I can give myself a general placement. Should be about there. But then I'm going to have to use my own sense of where things should go to help me place and fix up the nose so that it looks like her nose. And that's just going to be a matter of time. Okay, so in this phase, just really, I can't stress enough how much you really need to take your time and clean up all those fussy little details until it looks just like the girl in the picture. So I'm going to do that off camera now, finishing up in the same way that you've seen me do it so far, and I'll come back to you when we are ready to go on and start the painting phase. Okay, I'm pleased with how well the girl turned out, and so I'm ready to move forward with the painting. But you'll see that there's a really dark background here, and she's really front lit on top of it. So in order to get a really smooth, dark background without any flaws, I'm going to have to protect her completely, and then that will allow me to paint right over the top of her, both here in the rail and in the background. So that means I need to protect all of her, including her arms. So the best way of doing that is to either use masking fluid, like a masking fluid pen or something like that, and that's going to work really well for the places like the tiny hairs coming off her head. Then when you remove them, you'll have these bright hairs that will lend themselves really well and add a bit of realism. And they'd be really hard to get otherwise because you can't pick those really clean brights out again. You could only paint them in with white. Remember that that's always dangerous. So I'll put some in around the outside of the hair with the masking fluid pen. And then I'm going to protect the line. I'm just going to outline around the outside of her body. So with the arms and so forth, I'm just going to take my time and outline everything. And then I'm going to use Frisket film. Frisket film is like sticky paper that you can put right over the top. You put it over the top, you trace the outside shape, and then you cut that shape out of the paper, peel off the backing, and stick it down. And you can still see through it, so it's really handy for doing things like this. Just take a second and get mine. I've used Badger, which is easier to see through, and this other Graphics brand, which is thicker, but it tends to be a little bit more sticky. So that's why what I like to do is to combine Frisket film with masking fluid, and that way I can seal the outside really, really well. So I can see through here. I'm just going to trace the shape, the outside shape of her. And then be really careful wherever you need it to be precise, like around her arms and her fingers. Other than that, the outside shape is just hair, so it's not going to be that difficult to make it precise. And even if I'm not exactly right on, it's not that big a deal. Then you can just cut that out with the scissors. And then, just to save time, I'll show you the basic process here. When you cut your shape out, you're going to have to use your fingernail and get the backing off. That can be the trickiest part. But once you have that backing off, boy, this one's stubborn. There. Once you have that backing off, then you can just stick it down in place, and it's not so sticky that you can't reposition it a little bit. Then after that's down, press it down very firmly with your fingernail, and then this is what I mean by going around the outside. You might want to seal up the edges so that paint doesn't seep under, just like this. So let me take some time off camera and do that step, and then we'll come back and we'll be ready to start painting. Okay, now I have her all protected and I'm ready to lay in the background. Before I start though, look at the background, and you can see here some variation in color. It's not just solid black, and even if it were, I won't want to keep it solid black because that's boring. So I'm going to get some browns and some greens and reds and put those in the background. And I'm also going to tape out this ledge. Just going to use a piece of tape, put it right across that wooden thing, the banister, whatever she's leaning on. And I just want those two perfect sides preserved. There we go. Tamp them down really well with your fingernail. And then I'm not going to get the background wet because I need those colors to stay as dark as possible. So I'm just going to start with my mixture of some browns and some Payne's Gray. I'm going to start in a corner, go all the way to her hair and to the corners that you have protected with the masking fluid, and then just make it as dark as you can. Having those edges preserved is going to make your life so much easier, and you're going to get great effects. But I'm going to mix in some dark blues Payne's Gray, Burnt Umber, and just if you have a nice thick paint, it won't lighten up too much. You really want it to be dark because that's going to give you this fantastic contrast and make this piece so interesting and vivid. So see how I'm just letting one color blend into another here in the background. So I've got my blue patch, and then I go to a brown patch and a black patch. Not flat black, mind you, but that's Payne's Gray. Or indigo is a great one I like to use. You can use some dark purples, whatever you need. But get them all the way down to the features. And make sure that you don't have any one color that's just standing out by itself, like only one spot where there's a big boom of blue and then there's no blue anywhere else. You really need to keep the colors fluid and moving around and also existing in different places so it doesn't look like an accident. So maybe I want to stroke in here with a little bit of purple, but if I do it there, I'm going to do some down here as well. All right, fabulous. Let it dry. Okay, this is looking good. I might want to go back a few places with some more Payne's Gray before it dries entirely. Just make a few places a little bit darker. That's my own choice though. It really depends on what you want to do. I like that more because it's just a little bit more dramatic. And I can still go in with another color. So here, I can still touch in with my purple over the top of that again. Touch in with the blues. And it's still going to show up, especially when it dries. Then I'm going to remove just the tape for that ledge. See, I got a nice sharp line out of it. Excellent. And then I'm going to use some more tape, and we're going to paint the bottom right here, that kind of light purple. So I'll use one continuous piece of tape. Position it carefully right over the line that you've drawn with the ruler. Oop. Then tamp it down. Mix up your purple. It's kind of a pinky purple. That's good right there. And just whoop, paint it right across. Got a little light on this side, so I'll add some more color, some more pinks. Very good. And now let it dry again. Okay, this purple is nice and dry, so I can remove the tape. Pretty clean line. There's a little bit of fuzziness, but that is a perfect place for that to happen because the color right next to that purple is very, very dark. So I'll paint that next. I'm going to use another piece of tape. Very carefully get it right up next to that purple line. You can see then that the fuzziness is still visible. Tamp it down really well. You're really trying to keep the color from seeping under the tape. And then I'm going to use a very dark Payne's Gray, and it's darkest on the right side, so I'm going to start there, brush across, and then it starts to go a little bit lighter on the left side. You can start to see almost like a green under there, so I'm going to paint that down as well, and then I might even do a little blot. And we're going to leave that to dry. But I can also remove the masking fluid around the outside of the girl at this time. And take off the paper. Now you can see it did seep under her arm a little bit, so I'll show you how to deal with that. Sometimes nothing you do quite works. I rub all of this off, and then I'm going to use my masking fluid pen one more time, and I'm going to re-protect the little lines inside the hair. So if you look at the reference material, you can see that there's some strong highlights right in here and on the base of the hair. I'm going to go and protect those with a little bit of masking fluid. Not everywhere, but just in a few areas so that I won't lose those details. Just be really careful that you're putting the masking fluid down in the direction of the hair growth, so that you don't have something incorrect preserved, and then it's very difficult to clean it up. See just a few hairs going around. I'm going to let that dry, and I'll come back and show you what to do next. Okay, as you might have guessed, the next step here is to remove the tape. Turned out nice. Pretty good. There's a line here that we'll need to clean up, but not bad. And now I'm going to retape this edge up here, moving it all up. Doing the same process. Carefully, and then tamp it down really hard. Then I'll tape off the bottom here as well. So now we're doing the dark wood part. Let me see if I've got that highlight protected. I don't. So I'm going to come down just a little ways and preserve the highlight on this piece of wood. Yep, right there. That way when I remove it, I'll still have a little white spot. There's a strong highlight on the wood, you can see in the reference material. So I want to keep that, but then I'm just going to do the same thing, mixing up a dark color for the wood. I'll do a test strip, make sure I match my colors. And just tape that, or just paint that across. Touch in with some blue here and there. I'm making the right side a little bit darker, so that's consistent. Then while that is doing its thing and drying, I can go into the flesh tones a little bit. So this here is a problem. Remember we had that mistake where the paint seeped through the masking stuff. So what I can do is damp a little angled shader, dampen this a bit, and then blot and try to pick up as much as I can of the paint. It works a little. The problem is this is so dark. So what we're going to wind up having to do is paint over it with white. This is one of those few cases where it's the only way you can save the painting is by using some white paint. So that's going to be just fine. For right now though, let's work on our flesh tone in the face. We'll paint the flesh tone over here, and then it's a really light area, so I'll probably have to finish it up by painting white over the very top. But don't try to mix up a white based flesh tone because it will make it opaque. We don't want that. So I'm going to use some alizarin crimson, Winsor red, Winsor yellow. Mix that up and see what I've got. Might need a little bit more Winsor red there. That's good. And then I'm going to focus on the side of the face that is in shadow. I'm going to paint right up to the hair. I'm going to avoid the eyes, but other than that, I'm painting everything. And see how I paint right up to the eyes. Over here, it's going to be dark, and I'm focusing in the darkest parts first. I'm going to have to remove this tape so that I get all of the flesh tone covered. And her skin is really light, so there's a huge difference between the darks, or the flesh tone is only in the darkest places, and then there's really just white. I'm going to change that up a little bit so that I have a little bit more color. I don't want her to look like a snowman. So in this first pass, I'm just sort of wetting over everything. Then I'm rinsing over in the really light parts with just a clean brush. But that's going to blend in these shadow shapes and make them a little bit less geometric. I want them to be soft and look like real skin. Then I'm going to take some purple and push up those shadows a little bit more. while the color is still fairly wet. And just make sure that whatever you do in one area, you do in another area of the same lighting circumstances. So the side of the face is in shadow, and so is this arm, and so is this arm right under here. I need to treat them all with the same color combinations. I'm going to go in again with some red. And while the color is wet, I'm just dropping it in. I'm just dropping in the new color and letting it sit there. I'm looking for the shapes of the shadows on her face. So side of the nose, side of the face here, under the lips, around the eyes, etc. Just, if you need to, you can squint at your reference material and get a better sense for where those all go. And you can't push it too far or everything will start to get really cloudy. So when you're at about this level, you need to let it rest. I'm just going to get one more pass of pink in the cheeks before I do that. Make sure that you have plenty of reds in your flesh tone. As it dries, it's going to get more and more brown, and it's going to look sort of ugly and flat if you don't have enough reds in there. Okay, that's a good place to stop. We'll let this dry, and I'll come back in a few minutes. Okay, this is dried, so I can remove my tape. Then there's one more place to tape. And that is this side here. And this side over here. So my final step for the wood is going to be painting in this top wood, which has more red and yellow in it. And instead of painting, or instead of taping that shadow, or I'm sorry, instead of taping this line with that has the highlight on it, I'm just going to paint carefully, because the highlight isn't absolutely precise. There's little imperfections in the wood. I'm actually going to get a more realistic effect if I don't tape it. So you just have to decide as you're working what is going to be the best way for you to get the effect that you need. And I'm going to go carefully around her fingers. These two have been masked, so they are going to be fine. Then I have a lot of gold up here. So I'm going to put this base layer on, and then I'm going to go back and add the details of the wood grain, because the wood grain is a lot darker. Then as I push to the right and everything is in shadow, this top part is also going to be darker. Make sure that there's a notable difference between the light and the dark wood grain. So I'm just doing the light. I'm going to let that dry, and then I'll go over the details with that darker color. To clean up down here, you can just dampen a straight edged brush, like a flat, and gently wash it down, straightening up your color like this. And because the main part of the line is still going to be really straight with the tape, these little areas where you have to make alterations aren't going to ruin the effect. It just cleans it up a little bit. Then you can see that her skin tone got a little bit murky. So we can clean that up. I'm just going to remove the tape. Just got under the tape, so I'll wash that out. There we go. I'm just going to go back and accent the reds on her skin a little bit more. And I can clean up this cloudy part just using a clean, damp brush and washing over the top like this. And to keep that from bleeding as it dries, you can just damp it or tamp it with a dry, clean paper towel. Do that wherever you need to clean up the skin tone. And on the face, I'm going to go back and soften the edges of these shadow shapes, doing the same thing. Just get it a little wet, and then I tap it with my paper towel. Using as large a brush you can for the area so that you can have the smoothest finished look. So I'm making this forehead a little bit lighter by pulling out some of this color, and then I just blot it. And that highlight shape is going to go right into the nose. And then I have a brighter highlight on this side of the cheek. So I'm blotting in the large shapes now of the highlights. Sometimes you're looking for the shapes of the dark, sometimes you're looking for the shapes of the light. But I blot after getting it wet because I don't want those colors to bleed as they dry, and otherwise they do. So this stage will give me those nice realistic transitions from shadow to mid-tone to highlight that you see on something soft like skin. And then with a smaller brush, a small round, I can go in and accent around the elbow with a little bit brighter orange. Okay, that base tone of the wood has dried, so I can go back in now with my darker wood color and paint some wood grain. Just going to do that with a small round and start to the far left and just carefully drop in some lines like this to stand for the wood grain. If you want to be more careful than this, you can draw them before you start painting. Notice that I didn't take the masking fluid off her fingers yet because I knew I needed to paint over the top. I'm going to get the most realistic results if I can paint straight over the top without interrupting the flow of the paintbrush at all. And I can only do that because her fingers are protected. The same thing goes for this shadow cast by the hand onto the wood railing. So you want to put those shadows in while the masking fluid is still there as well. So I can finish that off camera, and then the other thing that I can do here is work on her hair. I love to paint hair. So I'm going to get a base tone first, and I'm going to paint in the direction of the hair growth. Keep some highlights, and if you've protected your highlights, don't be afraid to go really dark around them. If you've protected them with masking fluid, you can just go straight over the top. See your part here gets really dark, and you want to make sure that you go all the way down to the skin tone, so make sure that your skin is completely dry before you do this. And I like to drop in blues and purples into the hair, especially where it's nice and dark. Gives it a lot more interesting look. There's some purple. You can't even tell that it's purple, but it just makes it look more full. And on this side, it's more golden. So I have a lighter color, this honey yellow. And then I'll mix into that with some browns. The only important thing to remember when you're painting hair is that you have fun with it and let the colors mix together on the page. Don't be afraid of colors, okay? Like I showed you already the secret of using purples in the shadows and things like that. And then leave some highlights. Next to the face, you need to be really, really careful because it's going to carve out the shape of the face a little bit more. So I'm going with a dry paper, a very intense dark, and I'm carefully filling in the shape around her fingers and her arm. It's these sharp lines of really, really strong contrast that are going to make your piece just pop. So you need to do them carefully, and you need to do them very well. Don't be afraid to go intensely dark. But remember that if there's any mistake in your drawing, that is going to show up really well. Your mistakes get magnified, which is what makes it so powerful. If there aren't any mistakes, then it just looks fantastic. So that's why you need to take so much time on the drawing phase and get those lines right before you ever start painting. Don't be afraid of intense color. But then you need a strong contrast, so I'm just going to paint through some of this color with a wet brush that's clean. Drag the color up, and that will give me a natural gradation from dark to light, just like real hair. See, now it's really coming through. The way people mess up on hair is they go too blah with their colors and they play it too safe with those shadows next to the face. So I'll just finish this up off camera, doing that same thing, and I'll come back when it's time to remove the masking fluid. Now I finished the hair, at least the first pass of hair, because now the next thing to do is to remove your masking fluid. Just rubbing with a rubber cement eraser, taking out all those white little lines, and then you can see that some of them are a little blobby. We don't want that, so I'm gonna have to go back now and clean them up. But around the outside of the hair especially, you can see how effective that is. I'm also gonna remove the masking fluid on the fingers and any other place you might have some. So now it's down to just the bare painting. If there are places where the paint got a little bit sloppy, go ahead and clean those up with a damp angled shader. Just rub gently with some clean water here and then let it dry. And next, we can add, you can see on the photo reference here that there's a big difference between the shadow side of the face and the highlight side of the face. We have a shadow side here, but it's not quite strong enough. So the first thing I'm going to do here is strengthen that a little bit. I know that it's tempting to use a round brush when you're doing something like a face, but you are going to get much better results if you use a flat brush and think of that as putting in a nice solid shape. Let's color match, that's good. Keep your reference close. And now I'm looking for that large shape by the side of the face. And I like to leave just a little bit of a line around the outside here. Helps it to look a little bit more round and three-dimensional. I'll drop in some brighter orange. And that same color needs to go onto the arm. It's not ideal to be doing this after having taken off those little hairs with the masking fluid, but it's okay, it can work. You just need to have some extra care. And you need to make sure that you're doing your same shadow colors on all of the shadow shapes so that it doesn't look like a mistake. So here by the side of the nose, I'm going to strengthen that shadow, putting it in as a shape. Take your time and do a good, careful job on the face. It's really important. And use the largest brush that you can for the area. Now I'm getting into those smaller shapes, so I might be pushing it a little bit. I'll have to downsize to a smaller brush here in a minute, but let me add some darker areas as long as this is wet and the colors will blend together really well. I know that it looks weird. It's going to look weird for a little while. But don't worry. We're going to soften out the edges, and then that deep color will remain and it's going to look great. So I'm taking out some lights. Now I've moved to my flat brush and I'm wetting the edges and I'm blotting to make them blend in a little bit better. This part is tricky. You're going to have a lot of practice working with the watercolor, knowing when you can blend safely and when it's going to make a bleed. You just need to develop a feel for doing this. But you can watch me do it. You can see about how wet my paper is, and that'll help you to know when you should be doing the same thing. But mostly, you're going to have to just practice on your own. There's no substitute for hard work. I'm going to have to let this dry on the nose and then put the shadow in a little bit more carefully with a smaller brush. But for now, I'm just going to get rid of those harsh edges. And soften things out like this a little bit. I can also add some lip color. As you add the lip color, make sure that you don't work over the highlights. Highlights in the lips are really important. My eyes drag through with a clean brush to make those fine lines, and then to gently blot and soften that line of contrast. When the lips dry for the first pass, then I can darken up the line between the two lips and the corners. And then I'm going to add some details above the eye. This stage is a lot easier if your drawing is still visible, and of course if your drawing is really accurate. It's going to be much, much harder if you're trying to paint from a drawing that's not quite right. So before you start adding lines to the features, double check that your drawing still looks good. And if you need to strengthen some lines that may have gotten washed out, do that too. So I just kind of strengthen these lines. You're not outlining, you're just carefully darkening up some of the contours, and you're still keeping to the principle of lost and found edges. So they're not all hard edges. Here at the corners of the eye, I'm going to use clean water and soften it. Soften it again. And then with a small round, I can add the outline of the eye. This is the iris. Make sure that your irises are the same size. And work hard to get them nice and round. A nice dark pupil. The pupil is the only thing on your painting that can be black. I still paint mine with a really dark Payne's gray, but it does need to be really, really dark. And darken up those lashes. It looks like her eyes are almost interesting green color. So I'll just add a little bit here and there, not filling it in, and then wash out the brush and fill in just by blending the color out. And that will give me a nice subtle gradation. I might need to reshape things once the eyes have dried a little bit more. Like I might have to reshape this nose when that's completely dry as well. And then I can add some pink to the bottom side of the fingers, just sort of accenting the curves, just like this. So you're almost outlining in this stage. You're almost outlining in this stage, but it's not quite the same because you're not touching every line and you're not always touching it with the same strength. So you're going to have thick and thin, you're going to have dark and light, you're going to have lost and soft, and hard. So you have a line variety, you have a color variety, you have a contrast variety. You need to keep all of those things in mind as you paint. And that goes for whether you're painting realistically or not, whether you're painting people or trees. The same principles apply to everything. So that makes it a little bit easier, right? It's not like there's just scads and scads of things to remember. It's always the same artistic principles. It's not just painting in watercolor either. It's painting in everything. It's drawing also. So once you learn it well, you can apply it to any medium and any subject matter. So as we push this along, it's getting stronger and stronger and the realism is growing. You just have to slowly build it up and know where to soften things and where to strengthen contrasts and so on. So you don't have to really come up with those decisions on your own, by the way. The way that you know what to do is by paying close attention to your reference material and to the world around you. You're going to grow as an artist if you will always take some time out of your day and just examine things. Try to determine how the light affects different objects. Look at a face in different lighting situations. And then you're going to start to be able to see things as an artist. You take all of those little lessons and you bring them into your artwork. That's why people keep a sketchbook too, because you don't just have to remember everything. You can make notes, drawn notes and written notes, and keep them all in your sketchbook. So you might have a page of your sketchbook devoted to studies of eyes, or studies of shadow shapes on a face, or studies of hands, or studies of something that aren't even related to people. Okay, it doesn't matter what you do. The point is that you're keeping track and you're being observant. And this the sketch journal will also help you to remember to practice every day. I'm darkening this area behind. I might have to darken that up a little bit more. So now this is really coming along. I'm going to add some eyebrows. Don't go too crazy with the detail on the eyebrows, by the way. That's a place where people tend to make too many little hairs and then it looks too hairy, especially considering that this is just a little girl. She doesn't have very pronounced eyebrows. So just a few lines and then kind of a smudge of color will indicate the rest. I'm gonna soften this line of the nose because it's making the nose look pushed over too far. So anyway, let me do this sort of thing off camera now. I'm going to just kind of add some finicky little details here and there. I'm also going to be softening some of these lines that I protected with the masking fluid. And I'll be doing that by just slicing through with a damp brush, blotting, and repeating. It just takes a lot of time, but there's not a trick to it. Once you know how to do it, it's just the same thing over and over again. So I'm going to go off camera. I'm going to finish up the wood grain here. You've already seen me do that. And then I'll come back and show it to you one more time. Okay, I have cleaned up the face. And so comparing that to the original reference, you can see that the shadow shapes and the contrast are closer to what I see in the painting. So the painting is closer to the reference now. I toned down this highlight in the wood, and I might want to just add a splash of that red or orangey color in the wood, and that's going to help bring some of those reds from the skin tone down into different places on the painting. Always a good idea. It almost looks like the red is bouncing off and the colors are bouncing into each other. I like that. Maybe a little bit up here as well. But once you get it to the point where you feel like everything is about as done as you want it to be, the last thing that you might need to do is to go back with some highlights if they got painted over. What I like to use for that is Aqua Cover. It is liquid watercolor paper that is tinted to the same color as your watercolor paper. So like Arches Natural White is what I paint on. So this product is that exact same color. And I keep it completely separate from the rest of my paint in a little dish because I don't want it to touch any of my paint on the palette. It will make the colors opaque and then they won't layer transparently anymore, so I don't want that. But it is handy if there are areas that you need to bring out again, tiny little hairs, or if you have a mess up like we did right here, you can cover it. I saved it for last so that you can see how it would look before and after. You might prefer the look of the painting without doing that, in which case, of course you don't have to. I just wanted to show it as an option. It's really heartbreaking if you have a really great piece and it would be spectacular except that you lose a small highlight or two. I wanted to show you that if that ever is the case for you, you can bring out those little things with some Aqua Cover. Just don't overuse it. I only use it for small highlights. I don't mix it with my paints. I don't use it for large areas. And then it can be a little fussy to work with because if you try to blend it into the rest of your color, you can see how it starts to sort of semi-cover. It takes on a different look. It does cover that ugly edge that I had though, so I prefer it to what I had before. And it is good in certain circumstances. I might want to use it in some of those hairs around the outside of the head as well. You can be the judge, but now that you have that product in mind, it's a little tool that you can use in your toolbox. So the last thing is to take off your tape and reveal your borders. Always the most satisfying part of painting. And having the white frame around it, you can really see how it would pop with a light colored frame or matte. That would bring out those highlights even more. Don't take it off the board though. If you have it stapled down, or if it's on a watercolor board, or like a watercolor pad where it's glued on the sides, don't separate that yet. Give it a couple of days. Come back to it with fresh eyes a few times and then see if you're absolutely sure that there are no mistakes. Once you take it off the board, it's a lot harder to fix mistakes, because when you re-wet the paper, it will wrinkle on you and then you're not going to be able to get it flat again. So keep it tamped down, keep it stretched as long as possible. When you're absolutely sure, pull out the staples, and there you have your finished piece. So that completes this watercolor tutorial. I hope that you've learned some things you can take away with your own studio. And of course, I thank you so much for watching.